Today, we're diving into a fascinating period in history, the German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525. This wasn't just any old rebellion, it was a full-blown uprising where the lower class in the Germanic regions of the Holy Roman Empire rose up against their noble overlords. The conflict revolved around issues of feudal serfdom, the fight for religious freedom, and a deep economic divide. So, what sparked this massive revolt? Well, the roots of the uprising are still debated, but two key factors were the rise of humanistic philosophy and the religious reform movement spearheaded by Martin Luther. People were starting to question the established order and hoped for a radical shift in society. Adding fuel to the fire, the Knights' Revolt of 1522 to 1523, led by Franz von Sickingen and inspired by the knight poet Ulrich von Hutten, encouraged peasants to resist paying taxes and tithes. At that time, the Roman Catholic Church was demanding 10% of the peasants' wages as a tithe, and the nobility had their own taxing systems, keeping the peasants in poverty. When Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Church between 1517 and 1521, kicking off the Protestant Reformation, many hoped he would also champion the peasants' cause. However, when Luther didn't take up their fight, other reformers like ThomasMüntzer took the lead. Müntzer initially thought Luther would support the peasants, but when that didn't happen, he became one of Luther's harshest critics. Alongside Müntzer were figures like Florian Geyer, Hans Müller, and Wendell Hippeler, who organized the revolt against what they saw as the unchristian and unfair practices of the church and nobility. The peasants were up against formidable foes. Unlike the well-armed and trained noble armies, the peasants were poorly equipped and lacked experienced leadership. Their fragmented efforts led to a series of brutal defeats, culminating in their final defeat in 1525. It's estimated that around 100,000 peasants lost their lives during the conflict, with many more succumbing to starvation as their farmlands were destroyed. In many ways, this struggle was similar to the earlier Hussite wars, where a peasant class fought against the professional armies of the nobility. However, the German peasants lacked a strong leader, like Jan Sietzke, and they were no match for the superior tactics and weaponry of their enemies. Later on, philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels characterized the German Peasants' War as a classic example of class struggle, even seeing the peasant leaders as early champions of communist ideals. To understand the background of this conflict, we need to look at European society at the time. It was still structured much like the Middle Ages, with the nobility at the top and the peasants at the bottom. Between these extremes were lesser nobles, powerful clergy, and a merchant class. All these groups relied heavily on the taxes and labor of the peasantry, pushing them deeper into poverty. During the Middle Ages, the peasant class had gained some autonomy due to events like the Crusades and the Black Death, but they still couldn't escape the heavy taxation and demands for their labor. When Martin Luther's 95 Theses started spreading between 1517 and 1519, many peasants saw them as a challenge to the established order and began supporting Luther, hoping he would lead them against the aristocracy and the church. Some low-class clergy also hoped for a complete religious revolution to end the corruption they saw within the church. One of these clergymen was ThomasMüntzer, who began questioning church teachings and policies as early as 1514. By 1517, Müntzer was in Wittenberg when Luther posted his 95 Theses and later traveled to Leipzig in 1519 to support Luther in a debate with the church. Initially, Müntzer saw himself as a follower of Luther, but by 1521, he had begun embracing German mysticism and the idea that dreams and visions were messages from God. He believed he was living in the end times and that Christ's return was imminent, which drove him to push for more radical reforms. Müntzer eventually broke with Luther's teachings and started preaching in Allstedt, Saxony. Luther, fearing Müntzer's radicalism would harm the Reformation, summoned him to explain himself, but Müntzer refused. Just as the reformer Huldrych Zwingli in Switzerland had inspired the Anabaptists, Luther's movement in Germany inspired Müntzer to envision a complete social and religious transformation. Luther believed that Scripture should be the final authority on religious matters and condemned Müntzer's attack on the social order, citing biblical passages like Ephesians 6:5-9, which instruct servants to obey their earthly masters as they would Christ. Müntzer rejected this view, seeing the Bible as just one way God communicated with humanity. And now let's dive deeper into the German Peasants' War and the role of ThomasMüntzer, whose radical vision ignited a powerful movement among the oppressed peasant population. Fed up with heavy taxes, lack of property rights, and overall poor treatment, the peasants found hope in Müntzer's apocalyptic vision of a new social order. Now, imagine living as a peasant back then. You're not allowed to fish or hunt on the lands you work because those lands technically belong to your lord. When the head of your household dies, the lord can seize your tools and belongings, leaving your family with nothing. On top of that, you're burdened with exorbitant taxes and ever-increasing demands for labor. The frustration was palpable, and by 1524, peasants had had enough. Inspired by Müntzer and others, peasants began to organize into groups called Haufen, each with its own governing body, the Ring. These groups, ranging from 2,000 to 8,000 members, set their own laws and maintained order. The movement gained momentum in late 1524 when peasants in southern Germany rebelled after a countess demanded they stop their harvest work to collect snail shells for her thread spools. This act of defiance quickly spread, as the organized bands of peasants were ready for action. By March 1525, the peasants articulated their grievances in a document known as the 12 Articles, written by a furrier named Sebastian Lotzer and possibly the Reformed theologian Christoph Schappeler, with input from Wendell Hippeler and Müntzer. The 12 Articles demanded greater autonomy, tax relief, equitable laws, and the abolition of the inheritance tax. This document, considered the first human rights manifesto of the early modern era, was presented to the Swabian League, an alliance of the nobility. However, the nobility, backed by Martin Luther, rejected it outright. Here's where things get even more intense. Martin Luther, who had initially gained the peasants' support with his calls for religious reform, sided with the nobility when the insurrection began. Luther owed his life to the Elector Frederick III, who had protected him after he was condemned as a heretic. Fearing that the peasants' revolt would destabilize his Reformation movement, Luther preached against the uprising, using biblical passages to argue for maintaining social order. Müntzer, feeling betrayed by Luther, lashed out, calling him Dr. Liar and accusing him of being a pawn of the nobility. Müntzer argued that the Lutheran nobles were only interested in breaking away from the church for financial gain, not out of true religious conviction. In his writings, Müntzer passionately called out the lords and princes for treating all creation as their property, leading to widespread theft and robbery. His powerful words resonated with the peasantry and even some of the lesser nobility, who had lost lands and revenue to the more powerful princes. Among these disillusioned nobles was Florian Geyer, who had been an early supporter of Luther. By 1524, Geyer had joined Müntzer and the more radical reformers, fighting for a vision of social and religious transformation. And the peasant uprisings of 1524 continued to spread, and by early 1525, the peasants were in full-scale revolt. Encouraged by Anabaptist clergy who, despite their pacifist beliefs, saw the justice in the peasants' cause, these rebels formed into armies. They even borrowed tactics from the Hussite wars, like the use of the wagon fort, a movable fortification staffed by archers and pikemen. The first major clash came on April 4, 1525, at the Battle of Leipheim. About 5,000 peasants faced off against over 8,000 professional soldiers of the Swabian League. The peasants, outmatched and poorly equipped, were massacred in their retreat, with more than 3,000 killed. Retaliation was swift. Jacob Rohrbeck's peasant army captured the village of Weinsberg, took the castle, and brutally slaughtered the soldiers there. They forced captured nobles to run a gauntlet, beating them to death as they ran. Meanwhile, ThomasMüntzer was leading his own forces, supported by Florian Geyer and his Black Company, a group of knights dedicated to destroying the castles and monasteries that could serve as enemy fortifications. Despite their common cause, the peasant armies struggled to coordinate their efforts. Each group made decisions independently, often without consulting others. Hans Müller operated without coordinating with Müntzer, and while Geyer supported Müntzer's troops, the extent of this support is unclear. The peasant armies faced formidable opponents, including Georg III, Truchsess von Waldburg, an experienced military commander who won battle after battle. On May 12, 1525, he decimated a large peasant army at the Battle of Böblingen, killing at least 3,000 peasants while suffering fewer than 40 casualties himself. The decisive battle of the war occurred just a few days later, on May 15, 1525, near Frankenhausen. Müntzer, rallying his troops with claims of divine protection, faced off against the combined forces of Philip I of Hesse and George, Duke of Saxony. Despite Müntzer's exhortations, the peasant army, mostly composed of foot soldiers, was no match for the enemy cavalry. Around 6,000 peasants were slaughtered, with 600 taken captive. Müntzer fled but was soon captured, tortured, and executed on May 27, 1525. Jacob Rohrbeck met a similar fate for his role in the massacre at Weinsberg. Florian Geyer, misled to believe Frankenhausen was a peasant victory, rode to join Müntzer but was ambushed and his black company annihilated. Geyer himself was later assassinated by two servants who claimed to be escorting him to safety. The conflict dragged on through the summer of 1525, with Hans Müller's forces eventually defeated and Müller himself executed after torture. Wendell Hippeler survived the war but died the following year. By September 1525, the hostilities concluded with over 100,000 peasant casualties, and the oppressive status quo was restored. In the aftermath, Martin Luther issued his infamous condemnation of the uprising in his tract against the robbing and murdering hordes of peasants, calling on the nobility to crush the rebellion. This was ironic, considering the Church had previously condemned Luther himself as a rebel. Luther's stance caused many peasants to feel betrayed, and he lost significant support from the lower classes. For centuries, both Catholic and Protestant writers vilified Müntzer and the other peasant leaders. However, in the 19th century, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels reinterpreted these figures as proto-communist revolutionaries fighting against capitalist oppressors. This interpretation persists in some scholarly circles and in the history of certain countries, where the revolt is seen as a justified response to the unbearable demands placed on the poorest members of society.